The economy is booming, yet your life feels strangely stuck and smaller today. GDP headlines climb higher, politicians celebrate, but your paycheck barely stretches anymore still. Something doesn't add up, and that gap is where the real story lives. For decades, we were told growth means progress, money, better lives for everyone. But the numbers can rise even while your reality falls behind every year. To understand why, we need to follow how growth is actually measured first. Growth usually means gross domestic product, the total value of goods and services. Every purchase, every transaction, every construction project adds small piece to that number. When GDP rises, economists say the economy is expanding, producing more overall output. But GDP doesn't care who benefits, who pays, or what gets left behind. A billion-dollar luxury tower boosts growth, even if it helps almost nobody nearby. A highway project increases output, even if it replaces homes people relied on. GDP counts activity, not outcomes, motion, not meaning, spending, not well-being or stability. This is the first crack in the story we were taught to believe. Then there's inflation, the quiet force that reshapes what your money can do. Prices rise across housing, food, energy, and services, often faster than wages adjust. So even as the economy grows, your purchasing power shrinks in real terms. It feels like running forward on a treadmill, expending effort without covering ground. And then there's where the new wealth actually flows once it gets created. Because growth doesn't distribute itself evenly, follows ownership, leverage, and access to opportunity. Those who already own assets see their values rise much faster than wages. Stocks climb, real estate appreciates, businesses expand, and the gains compound over time. Meanwhile, people relying mainly on salaries experience slower increases, sometimes barely matching inflation. The gap widens because growth failed, but its rewards concentrate unevenly time again. And concentration has a compounding effect, reinforcing itself year after year across generations. This is how inequality can expand even during periods of strong economic growth. Another layer hides in productivity. The engine economists say drives long-term prosperity gains. When workers produce more per hour, the economy becomes more efficient, creating output. But higher productivity doesn't guarantee workers receive a proportional share of those gains. In many cases, the benefits shift toward capital, technology owners, and large corporations. Automation replaces tasks, software scales infinitely, and fewer people can generate massive revenues. The pie grows, but slices are distributed based on leverage, not effort alone. Then there's debt, the invisible accelerator that can boost growth without fixing fundamentals. Governments borrow to spend, companies borrow to expand, households borrow to maintain lifestyles. This creates activity today, but often pulls demand forward from the future years. At some point, the bill arrives, and growth slows as debt be serviced. So part of what looks like progress may be borrowed time disguised expansion. And while growth statistics rise, underlying fragility can quietly increase beneath the surface. There's also geography where growth happens matters just as much as how much. Prosperity can cluster in specific cities, industries, and networks, leaving other regions behind. Opportunities concentrate, talent follows, and entire areas experience very different economic realities daily. So national growth figures can hide local stagnation or even decline in communities. Then comes the role of policy shaping who wins and who falls behind. Tax structures, subsidies, and incentives quietly influence how growth distributes across society over time. Small changes in policy can redirect billions, often unnoticed by the public watching headlines. And sometimes those changes favor scale, capital, and influence more than everyday workers. Now layer in globalization, where companies can optimize costs across borders and markets. Production moves where it's cheapest, while profits can return where taxes are lowest. This increases efficiency, boosts growth, but doesn't always strengthen domestic wages or stability. Workers compete globally, while capital moves freely, shifting bargaining power in subtle ways. Technology accelerates this further, compressing time, distance, and cost across entire industries worldwide. Suddenly, A small team can outperform massive organizations that once dominated entire markets. This creates innovation, but also instability for those whose roles become less essential. And the transition isn't smooth. It's uneven, unpredictable, and often deeply personal. Meanwhile, markets celebrate efficiency, rewarding companies that do more with fewer people involved. Share prices rise, growth accelerates, but employment doesn't always keep pace alongside it. So the system can look successful from above while feeling disconnected on the ground. Then there's the psychological layer, expectations rising faster than actual living standards improve. Social media amplifies comparison, making stagnation feel worse even if income technically increases. People don't measure life against data, they measure it against what others appear to have. And that perception gap can widen dissatisfaction even during periods of economic expansion. Now contrast this with the narrative we're constantly told about growth and success. More growth means more opportunity, more innovation, more prosperity for everyone, eventually reaching all. But eventually is doing a lot of work in that promise over time. Because distribution isn't automatic, it's shaped by systems, incentives, and power structures beneath. And those systems don't always align with improving everyday life for most people. So growth can coexist with stress, insecurity, and a feeling of falling behind. Not because growth is fake, but because it's incomplete as a measure alone. It tells you how much is being created, not how it's experienced daily. And that difference is where confusion, frustration, and skepticism begin to build quietly. Now zoom out, because this isn't just about individuals, it's about long-term stability. When large groups feel disconnected from growth, trust in institutions can slowly erode. Economic systems rely on belief as much as numbers to function smoothly over time. If people stop believing growth improves their lives, behavior begins to change fundamentally. Spending patterns shift, political choices evolve, and social tensions can quietly intensify beneath. This is where economics meets psychology, and the consequences become harder to predict. Because numbers can signal strength, while sentiment signals something entirely different underneath. And ignoring that gap has historically led to unexpected turning points in economies. Moments where everything looked stable, until suddenly it didn't anymore for everyone. So the question isn't whether growth matters, it clearly does in many ways. The real question is what kind of growth actually improves lived experience for people. Growth that reaches broadly, sustains over time, and aligns incentives across the system. That kind of growth is harder to measure, but far more meaningful long-term. Because without it, progress can feel abstract, distant, and disconnected from daily life. And that's where the tension in modern economies continues to quietly build underneath. On paper, things improve, but in practice, many people feel increasingly uncertain. The contradiction isn't accidental, it's embedded in how we define and measure success. Which brings us back to where we started, that strange feeling something isn't adding up. Because you're not imagining it, the system can grow without lifting everyone equally. And understanding that is the first step to seeing the bigger picture clearly. But it also raises a deeper question about what we should prioritize going forward. If growth alone isn't enough, what metrics actually capture meaningful progress for society? And who decides which outcomes matter most when shaping future economic policies globally? Because those decisions will influence not just markets, but everyday life for millions. And they're often made far from the people most affected by them daily. So the gap between growth and reality isn't just economic, it's structural and systemic. Which means closing it requires more than growth, it requires rethinking the system itself. And that's where the conversation becomes more complex and far more uncomfortable. Because it challenges assumptions we've relied on for decades about progress and success. So if the economy keeps growing, but your life doesn't, what is growth really measuring?